The summer solstice came with thunder. In the grey dawn of 22 June 1944, the Red Army opened along a front that ran through forests, marsh, and sandy tracks, 1,000 guns folding the horizon into smoke. Operation Bagration is remembered for what happened in the middle, the collapse of Army Group Center, the sudden hollowing of a German front that had stood for 3 hard years. But even as the central hammer was raised, the real work of unraveling began at the edges, where rivers kinked, railways knotted, and the landscape resisted every easy line on a map. Soviet planners had looked at Belarus and seen not only a target, but a hinge. The German salient, the so-called Belarus Balcony, jutted eastward and invited encirclement. Yet experience had taught a harsh lesson. A decisive blow in the center meant little if the flanks stayed rigid. Reserves could slide along rail spines, counterattacks could bite into exposed shoulders, and a victory might dissolve into diffumide attrition. So the plan was layered. The First Baltic Front and the Third Belarusian Front would gnaw at the northern edge around Vitebsk and Orsha. The First Belarusian Front would pry at the southern edge around Rogachev, Partisan, and Bobruisk. If the sides sagged, the middle would not hold. The terrain promised both help and hazard. Northward, the western Dvina and the lakes and peat bogs of the upper country forced columns into narrow corridors, where a single destroyed bridge could stall a corps. Southward, the Pripyat marshes widened like a bruise, turning fields into a sponge and roads into ruts. Between them ran the Berezina and the Dnieper, waters that in summer could still be cruel. The Germans had learned to sit on crossing points and rail junctions, to feed battalions by train along spidery lines that vanished into pine. The Soviets had learned to break the web, not simply the spider. Maskirovka deception set the first terms. Dummy troop camps sprouted where no assault would come. Radio nets chattered in circles. Reconnaissance probed for hard seams and soft soil. Behind the German lines, Belarusian partisans read timetables and watched bridges, counting guard rotations and the minutes between trains. In the weeks before the guns opened, rails were wrenched apart in the night. Culverts disappeared. Telephone lines went dead. What reached the German command posts was not silence but confusion. And confusion is a slow fuse when an army must choose where to hold and where to bend. On the morning of the 22nd, the artillery spoke, and the infantry went forward under a moving wall of fire that chewed up trenchworks and splintered timber. Outposts vanished in the fog of cordite and rain, yet for all the grandeur of the barrage, the plan remained practical at its edges. The northern thrusts sought not a parade into open country, but the ruin of Vitebsk's connections and the unhinging of the German left. Southward, the aim was to crack the Bobruisk Hinge on the Berezina, to turn a defended river line into a pocket, and to make a German retreat, once ordered, far too late. Army Group Center held a front far longer than its means allowed. Divisions battered in winter offensives had been rebuilt on paper more than in the field. The Luftwaffe, once the quick courier of reinforcement, was thin. What remained to the Germans was the network, the railways that could move a regiment overnight, and the habit of obedience that kept units in place until an order came from higher up. In June 1944, that habit became a trap. Soviet fire plans opened lanes, and assault groups' infiltration teams with engineers, sappers, and flame squads went looking for the places where the map and the ground disagreed. In the north, pressure built around Vitebsk and Orsha. Forest tracks became avenues of advance after bridging units laid timber and corduroy over mire. The western Dvina's crossings became a test of routine. Could fresh artillery be brought up? Could pontoon parks unfold under smoke? Could engineers work faster than the defenders could align their guns? Reports from the German side speak of sudden pressure on weak battalions, of regimental staffs forced to move twice in a day, and of trains that did not arrive because rails behind the front had been lifted, one fish plate at a time. In the south, the land itself narrowed the options. The marshes channeled the first Belarusian front into the river arcs around Rogachev and Parichi and toward the bobbing piers of Bobruisk. Here, the Berezina loops like a question, and every answer begins with engineering. Assault detachments ferried across in storm boats. Heavier kit waited for bridges to grow from box trusses and rubber floats. Once a foothold was found, mobile groups nosed through the breach tanks with riders on the hull, self-propelled guns snorting along verges, supply trucks skipping potholes to keep pace with the leading edge. The purpose was not glory but geometry, to bend the line until it cracked into a pocket. Between these edges ran the middle, and the middle watched. German corps commanders, briefed to expect an attack, now had to decide whether the northern stirrings were secondary and the southern volleys a feint, or whether these were the first signs that the stage had been set to their detriment. To move reserves north risked a southern collapse. To hold fast invited envelopment. Orders stiffened. Bridges were to be held. Positions were to be maintained. Delay, always delay, until a counterblow could be arranged somewhere. But a counterblow demanded room, and room is what the flanks were taking away. The human dimension sat in the margins. Soviet gunners crouched under tarps to keep fuses dry in summer rain. Railway troops laid new sidings by lantern to bring ammunition forward. Partisan couriers passed through reed beds, with notes written in iodine on scraps of paper, then vanished into pine. On the German side, field, kitchens packed and unpacked as headquarters were displaced, and medical officers triaged by the light of blackout lamps while waiting for ambulances that never came. None of this appears in the grand maps, but each small delay and small success bent the arc of the first week. By 24 June, patterns had hardened into risks. Reports from the northern sector hinted at an encirclement forming around Vitebsk, where stubborn garrisons now fought with their backs to a tightening ring. South of the Pripet rim, bridgeheads on the Berezina were no longer just splinters of progress. They were platforms, and platforms invite leaps. The center, still formidable on paper, felt the pull at both sleeves. It is the sensation an army dreads, the stretch before the tear. This is where our story truly lives, not in the famous collapse alone, but in the quieter arithmetic that made it inevitable. The flanks are moving. Marsh, river, rail, and road are becoming weapons as sharp as any bayonet. And, as night falls on the fourth day, with smoke hanging low over the water and tracks leading west churned to mud, the question is no longer whether the sides can unravel the center, but how fast the unraveling will run. The answer waits where the northern forests thin toward Vitebsk, and where the southern river bends toward Bobruisk, and where a command, still convinced it can hold, is about to learn what happens at the margins when the margins are made to break. In the north, the forests opened into marshland, and the First Baltic Front prepared to strike. It was here, along the Vitebsk-Polotsk axis, that the Soviet plan revealed its craft: to peel away the northern shoulder of Army Group Center and cut the rail arteries that held it together. On 22 June 1944, the artillery along Bagramian's line thundered into life. The night had been still. By dawn, the ground shook with the measured cadence of the Soviet barrage. Where the shells fell, the swamp churned into grey, water, and the tree lines vanished under dust. Vitebsk, once a trading town, was now a fortress in name only. Its trenches followed the river bends and the high ridges, but beyond them stretched forests too dense to patrol, marshes too wide to watch. For years, German engineers had drained what they could and built plank roads to keep supply wagons moving. Those same tracks now became channels of attack. The 43rd Army pressed from the east, the 6th Guards Army from the north. In their wake came the mobile exploitation groups, tank brigades, and self-propelled guns poised to pour through any gap wider than a bridge. The first day's progress stunned even their own staff. Reports logged gains of up to 16 kilometers in the north sector, a number that, in the marshland of Belarus, seemed almost implausible. Soviet reconnaissance units fanned out beyond their maps, guided by partisan scouts who knew every creek and every railway culvert by name. Behind the front, Partisan detachments struck rail lines toward Polotsk and Dvina crossings, forcing German trains to crawl under escort or stop altogether. Each delay at the rear widened the fractures at the front. For the German Fourth Army, the problem was not only the attack but the direction. The Soviet pressure came from angles that defied the old trench grids. Artillery patterns shifted faster than field telephones could report them. Command posts were relocated twice in a day. Infantry regiments dug in along streams, only to find the next morning that Soviet armor had bypassed them through the bogs. The once steady lateral roads linking Vitebsk with Orsha and Lepel became corridors of wreckage. "We are no longer sure where our right flank ends," one German officer wrote. "Only that it is moving away from us." Bagramyan's staff called this a folding operation. The image was precise. Rather than a single thrust, the First Baltic Front's advance hinged on overlapping wings infantry, pushing across the Dvina's fords, while armoured columns looped west and south to seal the exits. Every bridge taken intact saved hours. Every crossing forced cost hundreds of lives and litres of fuel. Yet logistics held. Railway troops extended narrow-gauge lines across captured ground, hauling ammunition on flat cars lashed together from planks. Engineers built pontoon bridges under smoke, anchoring them in a current too swift for divers to work without ropes around their waists. By 24 June, the encirclement of Vitebsk had begun to close. The 39th Army pressed from the southeast, cutting the Orsha rail line. The 6th Guards Army swung from the north and west. Within the pocket lay 4 German divisions, the 206th, 197th, 246th Infantry, and the 4th Luftwaffe Field Division, now ringed by artillery that adjusted its fire with mathematical patience. Attempts to withdraw came too late. Hitler's order to hold Vitebsk to the last man arrived after Soviet armor had already severed the final road west. The fighting inside the pocket was brutal in scale but brief in time. Soviet units met resistance in every street. Bunkers had to be reduced by direct fire. But Bagramyan's purpose was not to grind the defenders, it was to seal them off. On 26 June, advance elements linked up west of the city. The encirclement was complete. That night, the horizon burned red as German supply depots exploded. By morning, Vitebsk was silent, save for the rumble of tanks rolling through the rail yard, where once, months before, trains had carried supplies toward Smolensk. Now the rails were twisted, the junctions useless. Beyond the pocket, the Third Belarusian Front joined the dance. South of Vitebsk, Chernyakhovsky's armies struck toward Orsha and the Smolensk highway, widening the gap between the collapsing Fourth Army and its southern neighbour. The northern flank had become a rolling gate, pivoting west to threaten the German rear as far as Lepel and Polotsk. By the evening of the 27th, reconnaissance patrols reported open country ahead, a rare phrase in a land of forests, and only scattered German rearguards firing from the tree lines. But success carried its own peril. The advance had outpaced supply. Fuel trucks bogged down in swampy verges. Pontoon bridges groaned under the weight of tanks. Soviet air units flew low, dropping canisters of gasoline by parachute to keep spearheads moving. The men called it iron rain. Yet the momentum held because the Germans could no longer respond in concert. What reserves remained were diverted south, where another storm was forming on the Berezina. The capture of Vitebsk opened a gap more than 50 kilometers wide on the northern wing of Army Group Center. For the first time since 1941, the German left flank in Belarus was gone. Villages that had lived under occupation for 3 years awoke to see columns of soldiers marching west instead of east. Behind them, field kitchens boiled soup over captured stoves. Engineers measured bridges. Partisans led convoys through detours that wound between mined roads. Each mile gained on this flank made the central collapse more certain. Still, the battle's outcome was not inevitable. South of the Berezina, the German 9th Army was digging in around Bobruisk, its own flank now at risk of being turned. High command debated shifting units from one wing to the other, but communication was slow and belief slower. Vitebsk, they argued, could still hold for a time, yet in the space of 5 days it had fallen. The north was open, the centre bending, and in the south, the first Belarusian front was readying its own blow. As June closed its first week, the northern marshes lay littered with spent shell casings and burned trucks. But the rail junctions that once fed Army Group Center now lay in Soviet hands. Smoke drifted over the western Dvina, where engineers mended bridges to bring the next wave forward. The line that had been a shield was now a seam, and the enemy who had guarded it was gone. To the south, across the marshes, another hinge was turning, and if the northern flank had cracked, the southern anchor would soon follow, setting the trap whose jaws waited at Minsk. In the south, the Berezina glimmered like a slow-moving mirror beneath the summer haze. The air smelled of wet earth and fuel, heavy with the scent of an army on the move. Here, the first Belarusian front under Konstantin Rokossovsky was about to strike the southern hinge of Army Group Center. It was a sector long considered too difficult for large-scale maneuver, half swamp, half forest, where the Pripyat marshes met the open plains near Bobruisk. But it was precisely this roughness, this sense of improbability, that the Soviets meant to use. Where the Germans expected obstacles, they would find direction. Rokossovsky's plan was audacious and precise. 2 main thrusts would strike around the town of Bobruisk, one from the north and another from the south, converging like claws to encircle the German Ninth Army. Each wing would fight its way across the Berezina's flooded bends and through marshy ground that barely supported its own weight. The armies involved 65th, 28th, and 3rd were to push west until their spearheads met behind the city. Once the jaws closed, the pocket would be sealed, and the road to Minsk would stand wide. On 24 June 1944, the bombardment began. Artillery along a 70-kilometer front spoke in a deafening chorus. The Soviet gunners had studied the ground for weeks, plotting each trench and strongpoint by aerial photograph. Shells landed in deliberate waves, methodical, their rhythm designed to break both earth and nerve. Behind the barrage, assault engineers moved with grappling hooks and planks, bridging ditches under fire. The Berezina crossings at Rogachev and Parichi were the gateways, and holding them meant everything. The German Ninth Army, under General Hans Jordan, was stretched thin. Its divisions were under strength, and its reserves trapped by orders from above. Hitler's directives were clear. No retreat, no surrender. Every village, every river line was to be a fortress. But fortresses need supply, and supply lines through the Pripyat edge were fragile, dependent on a single railway running through swampland and pine. Partisans had already made that lifeline bleed. In the days before the offensive, explosions echoed nightly along the tracks between Mosir and Slutsk. Bridges vanished, telegraph poles toppled. By the time Rokossovsky's first shells fell, the German south flank was already half blind. The first Soviet wave hit at Rogachev. Infantry advanced, waist-deep in water. Rifles held high. Pontoon bridges collapsed under the weight of the tank, forcing crews to wade or ferry across in rafts patched from timber doors. Yet the crossing held. By nightfall, the Third Army had forced a bridgehead 5 kilometers deep. To the south, near Parichi, the 65th Army struck through the marshes, using causeways and plank tracks built overnight by engineers. It was slow, exhausting work, but the German defenders could not be everywhere at once. Once the crossings were secure, tanks were dragged across by cables and tractors until the metal churned mud into foam. The Bobruisk offensive unfolded in 3 days of relentless movement. The twin pincers advanced, one cutting north from Rogachev, the other slashing upward from Parichi. German counterattacks met them head-on and failed. The air was filled with low-flying Soviet aircraft, strafing bridges and columns as they retreated west. Roads became traps, each cratered by artillery, each clogged with burning transport. On 26 June, the pincers closed east of Bobruisk. The encirclement was complete. Inside the pocket, up to 70,000 German soldiers were caught. Reports from survivors speak of confusion, of attempts to break out westward under cover of darkness, of entire battalions lost in the marshes. Soviet artillery had ringed the perimeter, and every movement drew fire. Smoke from burning fuel dumps turned the horizon black. When Rokossovsky's mobile groups entered Bobruisk on 27 June, they found the city a carcass of walls and twisted rails. What the shelling had not destroyed, the fires had finished. The strategic weight of this victory was immense. The destruction of the Ninth Army tore a hole at the base of Army Group Center's line, and no reserves remained to mend it. German headquarters demanded reinforcements from the north, but those had already been swallowed by the battles around Vitebsk. In a single week, the flanks that had once protected the heart of the German front in Belarus were gone. The center itself, still clinging to its positions east of Minsk, was now exposed on both sides, its communications unraveled. Yet even triumph has its complications. The Berezina crossings that had carried the attack now became bottlenecks for pursuit. Soviet columns raced to exploit the breach, but the roads were liquid with rain and churned earth. Fuel ran short. Tanks were abandoned for lack of bridges. Supply wagons lagged behind, their wheels half buried in muck. Rokossovsky's staff struggled to feed an army moving faster than its rails. But still, momentum was everything, and the push continued west. The human face of this advance was both grim and determined. Soviet medics tended to men who had marched for 72 hours without rest, their uniforms soaked through and their boots rotted from swamp water. Engineers collapsed by their own bridges after working under fire. Even the horses, caked in mud, were driven beyond endurance to drag the guns forward. In nearby villages, Belarusians emerged from cellars to find the occupiers gone and the front moving past them like a storm. Some offered water and bread to the soldiers. Others pointed out minefields or snipers still hiding in barns. Liberation came as both relief and disbelief. By the evening of 29 June, the remnants of the Ninth Army were finished. Rokossovsky's 65th and 3rd Armies swept the area, collecting prisoners and pushing west toward Slutsk. Reports spoke of tens of thousands of Germans killed or captured, though exact numbers would never be agreed upon. The Berezina, once a defensive line, was now a Soviet artery. Its crossings, rebuilt and widened, carried the flow of men and machines toward Minsk. For Army Group Center, this was the breaking point. The southern flank had collapsed, the northern was gone, and the middle was being cut to pieces. Walter Model replaced Ernst Busch as commander, inheriting an army that was no longer an army, but a scattering of trapped corps. The encirclement that Soviet planners had imagined weeks before was now unfolding with mechanical precision. The trap was closing. In the swamps around Parichi and the fields near Bobruisk, the echoes of that collapse lingered. Burned convoys lined the roads. Broken bridges floated downstream. Yet for the men of the First Belarusian Front, the battle was not over. Their next objective lay farther west, where the roads converged on Minsk. The question was no longer whether the flanks could hold, but how far they could reach before the enemy rebuilt a line. The storm was rolling on, and at its center, the remnants of Army Group Center stood in the path of a tide they could no longer stop. The wind over the Berezina carried the sound of collapse. By 29 June 1944, both flanks of Army Group Center were gone, Vitebsk in the north, Bobruisk in the south, and the vast pocket of German divisions in central Belarus had begun to cave in. For the first time since the invasion of the Soviet Union, an entire German army group was no longer a continuous front, but a collection of stranded islands, each fighting in isolation. The road to Minsk lay open, and from the east, the Red Army was moving to close the noose. The Soviet command called it the Minsk Offensive. In truth, It was the culmination of everything that had unfolded at the edges. The north and south flanks, stretched forward through marsh and forest, were now curving inward, bending toward one another like arms ready to clasp. To the north, the First Baltic and Third Belarusian fronts advanced along the Orsha and Lepel axes, cutting the Smolensk-Minsk highway and severing the German Fourth Army's escape route. To the south, Rokossovsky's First Belarusian front drove beyond Bobruisk toward Slutsk and Baranovichi, threatening to cut the German Ninth Army off entirely. Between them, the remnants of the Central Forces, once the proud heart of Army Group Center, struggled to retreat along roads, now choked with refugees, ammunition wagons, and burned-out vehicles. The Soviet pursuit had become a tide. Columns of tanks and mechanized infantry raced through the wreckage of forests and villages that had been battlefields only days earlier. The G roads were littered with abandoned guns and overturned carts. Dust rose from the ground like smoke. Commanders urged their men forward. To Minsk, no delay. In the Soviet imagination, the liberation of the Belarusian capital was more than a military goal. It was a symbol. The city had endured 3 years of occupation, its Jewish population annihilated, its industrial sites dismantled, its people used for forced labor. To reclaim it would be to erase a wound. The German retreat was chaos disguised as order. Ernst Busch had been dismissed on 28 June, replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, who inherited an army group already beyond rescue. His directives were pragmatic. Establish a new line west of the Berezina, hold Minsk long enough for trapped units to escape. But orders written in ink meant little to columns already shattered. Radio communications failed. Liaison aircraft were shot down or driven off by Soviet fighters. Entire regiments vanished into the forests without report. Those who survived moved at night, guided by the glow of distant fires. On the northern flank, Soviet spearheads reached Lepel on 30 June, severing the final rail connection to the west. To the south, Rokossovsky's mobile groups were already beyond Slutsk, moving northwest toward Minsk's rear. The jaws were closing faster than the Germans could flee. For every kilometer gained by the retreating troops, the Red Army gained 2. Partisans along the retreat routes cut down telephone poles, felled trees across roads, and guided Soviet tanks to bypass German rearguards. By 2 July, the main highway from Orsha to Minsk was lined with wreckage, stretching for miles, a moving graveyard of what had been Army Group Center. The terrain dictated the killing ground. Between the Berezina and the Svizlach rivers, a lattice of rivers, swamps, and forests hemmed in the retreat. Soviet aircraft flew low, turning columns of wagons into burning trails. Engineers raced ahead to throw bridges across the Berezina while the artillery deployed on the far bank. By the night of 2 July, Soviet vanguards were within 20 kilometers of Minsk itself. Local resistance groups rose in the city's outskirts, sabotaging bridges and ambushing patrols to hasten the collapse. At dawn, on 3 July 1944, forward detachments of the 2nd Guards Tank Corps entered the eastern suburbs of Minsk. Fighting flared in the streets, snipers fired from rooftops, and pockets of German infantry tried to hold intersections long enough for their comrades to escape west. By afternoon, Soviet flags flew from the city center. The liberation of Minsk was complete. That evening, the sound of gunfire subsided, replaced by the drone of aircraft and the muted roar of engines moving west, the pursuit already underway. The encirclement closed soon after. North of Minsk, Soviet forces cut the Molodechno road. To the south, the First Belarusian front reached Stolpci. By 8 July, the Minsk pocket had been sealed. Within it, some 100,000 to 130,000 German troops were trapped, their supply exhausted, their commanders out of communication. A week later, it was over. The Soviet press reported 70,000 prisoners taken and as many killed, though exact numbers would remain contested. Photographs of columns of captured Germans marching east under armed escort became one of the defining images of the campaign, the end of an army, and with it, the end of German dominance in the east. Yet victory brought its own fatigue. The Soviet advance had outstripped supply. Trucks broke down, horses collapsed on the road, fuel dumps lagged behind hundreds of kilometers away. Commanders rationed shells, airfields struggled to keep up. What had begun as a deliberate offensive now risked burning itself out through success. Rokossovsky and Bagration halted their spearheads briefly to reorganize. But even in a pause, there was no stillness. The need to consolidate, to secure the bridges, to repair the side railways, so that the next blow could fall farther west. For Belarus, the price of liberation was visible in every village. Charred cottages lined the roads, fields lay mined and cratered. Survivors emerged from woods and cellars, blinking at the sudden silence. They found their towns ruined, their families gone, but the front at last moving away from them. Soviet units shared rations, and engineers began rebuilding bridges the same day they crossed them. Behind the armies, teams from the NKVD and the Belarusian partisans took stock of what had been left: the dead, the collaborators, the ruins. The fall of Minsk marked more than the collapse of a front. It was the unraveling of an entire strategic conception. In a span of less than 2 weeks, the Wehrmacht had lost the backbone of its eastern defense. The flanks that had once been supporting arms were now the hands that closed the grip. From the Vitebsk forests to the Berezina plains, the encirclement was complete, a textbook execution of the deep operations doctrine that Soviet theorists had envisioned before the war, and that reality had now proven on a continental scale. But the question lingered: how far could this momentum reach before the machine consumed itself? The flanks, now stretched to breaking, faced new rivers, new fronts, and the growing challenge of supply. The Red Army stood on the threshold of Poland, and the map had changed forever. Yet even as troops rested in the ruins of Minsk, new orders were being drafted. The next stage would begin almost at once, north toward Polotsk, south toward Baranovichi, for the flanks of a victory are never still, and the war, even in triumph, does not pause. By the first week of July 1944, the thunder of artillery had faded westward, but the battle's edges were still alive. Along the northern flank, the First Baltic Front pushed through a maze of lakes and coniferous forests toward Polotsk, the old river port that guarded the approaches to the Dwina. In the south, Rokossovsky's men pressed beyond Slutsk toward Baranovichi, converting the remnants of pursuit into a deliberate widening of the front. These were no longer the supporting arms of Bagration, but its continuation, the flanks turning into frontiers. In the north, Ivan Bagramyan's forces had been ordered to drive beyond the ruins of Vitebsk and Orsha, pivoting northwest to secure the Dwina crossings. The Germans, trying to form a defensive line along the river, had little left to anchor it. Their formations were patchwork: security battalions, railway troops, retreating survivors from shattered divisions. Bridges that might have held were blown in haste. Others were seized intact by Soviet vanguards arriving hours ahead of schedule. Between 29 June and 4 July, the First Baltic Front launched what became known as the Polotsk Offensive, a 5-day dash through swamp, pine, and smoke. The terrain was merciless. Whole stretches of the Polotsk front could move only along single-track roads or on causeways built by engineers who waded waist-deep in bog water to lay timber. Tanks became stranded in peat, horses sank in the mud, yet progress came not through speed but through persistence. Every day, the Soviet advance pushed another 5 or 10 kilometers, erasing the last intact rail junctions north of Minsk. When Polotsk fell on 4 July, the Red Army gained not just a city but control of the northern gate to Belarus. German formations retreating from Lepel and Disna found their escape cut off. For the first time, the front from the Baltic to the Berezina had fused into a continuous Soviet arc. To the south, the rhythm was different, but the purpose was the same. Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front moved through the rolling farmland of the Baranovichi plain, following the debris of a defeated enemy. The marshes thinned into meadows, The forests broke into long, straight roads once built for German supply. Now they served the pursuers. Soviet columns advanced in waves, motorized infantry first, then artillery, then supply trains rattling behind. The wreckage of Bobruisk still smoldered, but already the lead units were 50, 60 kilometers beyond it. Baranovichi was a vital rail hub, the hinge between Belarus and Poland. The German command understood that losing it would end any hope of stabilizing the line east of the Bug River. But Hitler's orders to hold were again detached from reality. The divisions sent to defend the city, fragments of the 12th Panzer and 102nd Infantry, were exhausted, their numbers thin. Rokossovsky's pincer closed around them from north and south, supported by tank corps rushing through gaps left by shattered rearguards. On 8 July, Baranovichi fell after 2 days of street fighting. South of the city, Soviet cavalry mechanized groups cut the main railway to Brest, choking off the last German supply artery in the region. What had been the southern flank of Operation Bagration was now an open highway. In 10 days, the Red Army had advanced nearly 200 kilometers. Yet the deeper it pushed, the more its own structure began to strain. Fuel convoys crawled along improvised roads. Bridging units were forced to build and rebuild across the same rivers as spring floods tore out their work. The railways bombed and mined by both sides could not keep up. Soviet commanders complained that ammunition deliveries lagged behind the front by days. At times, entire tank brigades were halted, simply to wait for fuel. The victory was complete, but its maintenance was a battle of its own. Still, morale ran high. Villages along the Slutsk-Baranovichi corridor poured into the roads to greet the advancing columns. Women handed water to gunners perched on passing trucks. Children waved red ribbons from fences. Some of the men in Rokossovsky's ranks were Belarusian themselves, returning to towns whose names they had not spoken aloud since 1941. They found familiar fields seeded with mines and houses blackened by retreating flames. Liberation, here, was not triumph, but recognition the landscape of home revealed again through smoke. For the Germans, the retreat had become a rout without direction. Model's headquarters, now west of Minsk, tried to cobble together a blocking line along the Shara River, but the divisions assigned to it arrived as skeletons. 1,000 men here, 500 there. Stripped of artillery, orders to counterattack southward toward Slutsk were issued on 6 July and rescinded the next day, when aerial reconnaissance showed Soviet armor already behind the designated positions. In his diary, a German officer wrote, "There is no front, only fragments of one. Every road west leads into another column of fugitives." Meanwhile, the Soviets fought not only geography but fatigue. Engines overheated. Men slept in the open because tents could not keep up with the march. Rain turned the roads into shallow canals, and yet the advance went on. The logic of deep battle demanded momentum to keep the enemy from digging in again. Every delay risked giving the Germans time to rebuild across the Niemen or Bug, so the flanks pressed forward, widening, expanding, transforming from supporting operations into the new spearheads of a war already tilting toward Poland. By mid-July, Belarus was no longer a battlefield, but a liberated zone threaded with smoke from retreating fires. The Dwina and Berezina, once German front lines, now served as Soviet arteries. Polotsk to the north, Baranovichi to the south, both had fallen. The Red Army's map had changed shape. What had begun as 2 curved flanks around a bulging enemy had straightened into a broad front pointing west. But success carried a question. Each kilometer gained stretched the supply lines thinner, drew the soldiers farther from the bases that fed them, and brought them closer to the borders of another country, one that would soon become the next theater of war. The flanks that had secured Bagration's victory were still moving, still widening the arc, but ahead lay new rivers, new fortresses, and new exhaustion. The guns fell silent for a moment in Baranovichi as the last shots echoed away. On a hill outside the city, a Soviet signaller raised his antenna and caught the faint crackle of distant commands. New objectives, new lines to reach. The battle for Belarus was ending, but its flanks were already leaning toward the next horizon. The rain had stopped, but the smell of cordite still clung to the air. In the weeks after Minsk fell, the war in Belarus did not truly end, it changed shape. The front lines had moved west, yet the flanks, those restless margins of the great offensive, still pulsed with activity. Partisan groups, engineers, and supply convoys all worked in the long shadow of victory, trying to keep pace with an army that had outrun its own foundations. In the forests, north of Minsk, partisans emerged from 3 years of secrecy into the uncertain daylight of liberation. Their war had been fought in silence, blowing bridges, ambushing convoys, cutting the railways that fed German armies. Now, for the first time, they moved openly, meeting Soviet officers who had long known them only by code names sent over hidden radios. By summer 1944, the Belarusian partisan movement numbered over 300,000, an invisible army that had waged its own campaign behind the lines. Their maps were memories, their weapons, trophies taken from the enemy, and their work was not yet done. Even as Soviet divisions pressed westward, the partisans guarded the flanks, clearing mines, hunting stray German units, and protecting the fragile arteries of supply that snaked through the forest. To the south, along the Berezina and the Pripet's upper reaches, the cost of success began to show. The ground that had carried the Soviet advance now swallowed its aftermath. Trucks bogged down, horses sank to their knees in black mud. The railways that might have brought fuel and ammunition forward had been wrecked by years of occupation, their bridges dynamited by both armies in turn. Soviet engineers worked without rest, laying new ties, building temporary spans, and dredging river crossings. Entire regiments were diverted to repair the lifelines that kept the flanks alive. For every tank that moved forward, there had to be 10 men behind it, digging, bridging, refueling. Victory, here, was a matter of endurance. Rokossovsky's and Bagramyan's staffs faced a dilemma they knew too well. The farther the front advanced, the more exposed its flanks became. German remnants still roamed the forests, survivors from broken divisions, sometimes regrouped around isolated commanders, sometimes simply fighting to reach the west. They struck at convoys, ambushed patrols, and mined roads. Soviet field reports speak of bridges rebuilt 3 times in a week, of entire supply columns lost to sabotage. And so the Red Army's rear echelons became a second front of their own, a war of security and logistics, waged in the same silence the partisans had once kept. Even nature seemed an opponent. Belarus, in July, was a country of rivers swollen by rain, of mosquitoes, of roads that dissolved into swamps by afternoon. Fuel drums rusted in the open, food rotted in trucks before it could reach the front. Yet there was a grim efficiency to the Soviet system. Rail brigades advanced almost as fast as the infantry. Women from nearby villages joined the work crews, hauling gravel, hammering ties, and clearing mines with sticks and rope. Every meter of restored track meant another trainload of shells, another bridge that did not need rebuilding tomorrow. The German High Command, meanwhile, tried to make sense of what was left. The destruction of Army Group Center had left a void stretching hundreds of kilometers. Field Marshal Model's new lines were drawn, hastily, curving back through Lithuania and Poland. But they were lines on paper. What moved east to west now were survivors, retreating through the chaos the partisans had made. Between Vilnius and Brest, the roads were littered with the detritus of retreat helmets, rifles, burnt vehicles, columns of prisoners. The flanks that had once held the Soviet advance were now corridors of flight. In Moscow, news of the victory reached the public in waves of official announcements and cautious headlines. The liberation of Minsk was declared. Bagration was hailed as a triumph of deep battle, but in the field, triumph was a quieter thing. Soldiers bathed in rivers for the first time in weeks. The wounded were carried to the rear on makeshift stretchers. Engineers marked the ground with red flags, where mines still hid in the soil. Each evening, Artillerymen listened for the sound of guns to the west, and, hearing them faintly, knew the war was still ahead. For Belarus, the end of the campaign brought both freedom and reckoning. Villages that had lived under German rule for 3 years were now scenes of discovery. Mass graves uncovered, deportation lists found in burned police stations, partisans reunited with families long presumed dead. In many towns, the return of Soviet authority meant the arrival of NKVD units tasked with restoring order and investigating collaboration. Justice, like reconstruction, moved unevenly, carried by soldiers still in uniform. The partisans who had fought in the shadows now found themselves catalogued, reorganized, absorbed into the state they had helped to restore. The logistics officers called it stabilization, but the men at the front simply called it waiting. Waiting for fuel, waiting for bridges to dry, waiting for the next advance order. By mid-July, those orders came. The First Baltic Front was to continue north toward Vilnius and the Baltic coast. The First Belarusian Front was to turn west toward Brest and the Polish frontier. Operation Bagration was officially declared complete, yet its momentum refused to die. The flanks that had begun as supporting blows were now the new leading edges of the war. In the forests, the last echoes of battle still lingered. The distant crack of gunfire, the rumble of trucks, the hum of aircraft sweeping west. The marshes gleamed under summer rain, their surfaces calm, concealing the wreckage beneath. For a moment, there was the illusion of stillness, the pause before another storm, but every soldier knew the truth. The war had not ended in Belarus. It had only changed direction, and on those weary, forgotten flanks the rivers, the bridges, the endless roads through swamp and forest. The Red Army's victory was still being built plank by plank, rail by rail, until the silence of one front became the thunder of the next. When the maps of Belarus were redrawn that summer, few outside the war rooms saw the pattern. Operation Bagration had not merely destroyed an army group, it had shifted the geometry of the Eastern Front. What began as the steady cracking of flanks now revealed its full consequence. A corridor of liberation stretching from the Baltic to the Pripet marshes, where the Red Army stood poised on the doorstep of Eastern Europe. By mid-July 1944, the northern flank under Bagration had pushed deep into Lithuania. His troops took Polotsk, then Daugavpils, bridging the Dwina under fire and reaching the borders of the Baltic states. The Germans fell back toward Riga, trying to form a new defense called the Panther Line. But the retreat lacked coherence. Columns of lorries and horse carts jammed the roads west of Dvinsk. Bridges collapsed beneath the weight of artillery that could no longer be hauled forward. What was once a flank was now a floodplain of withdrawal. Soviet forward detachments reported entire stretches of country abandoned, the enemy visible only as smoke on the horizon. In the south, Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front swept toward Brest and the Polish frontier. Towns like Baranovichi and Minsk were liberated almost in stride. The Germans attempted to regroup along the Bug River, hoping that the marshes and flooded fields would slow the pursuit. Yet every crossing the Wehrmacht prepared to defend had already been reconnoitered by Soviet engineers or partisan guides. Bridges materialized overnight, ferries churned across under camouflage nets, and the Soviet spearheads rolled over the border. By late July, advance units had reached the outskirts of Lublin. Belarus, once the center of Hitler's occupied East, was free. For the soldiers who marched through it, the victory felt both immense and unfinished. The fields were blackened, the forests filled with unburied wrecks. Civilians drifted back into towns that no longer had names on road signs, guided by memory rather than maps. Grain stores were empty. Wells were fouled. Roads were mined. The Red Army left behind as many labor battalions as combat ones, railway troops, engineers, medical columns, to knit the land back together. Every day, telegraph lines rose again between towns. Every night, trains crept west, over rails laid by torchlight. In Moscow, the triumph was announced with artillery salutes and headlines that spoke of the liberation of Belarus. Yet among commanders, there was little celebration. The flanks that had made the victory possible were still vulnerable. Supply lines ran hundreds of kilometers from their depots, threading through country where the infrastructure had been burned to the ground. Even in victory, Soviet logistics were on the verge of exhaustion. A single bridge failure could delay an entire front. For the Germans, the aftermath was worse than defeat, it was erasure. Army Group Center ceased to exist as an organized force. Of its 40 divisions, more than half had been destroyed. Those who escaped were scattered across Poland, regrouping under new commands that bore little resemblance to the armies of the previous month. Hitler's order to hold every meter had turned Belarus into a graveyard. The soldiers who survived carried the memory of those flanks, the slow encirclement, the unseen roads behind them cut away as a symbol of inevitability. Strategically, the consequences rippled far beyond the marshes. Bagration's success forced Germany to divert divisions from France, just as the Allies broke out from Normandy. It redrew the balance of the war. The Eastern Front now pressed west with unstoppable weight, and the Balkans, the Baltic, and Poland all stood exposed. In Berlin, the General Staff spoke of a catastrophe without precedent. In Moscow, the Stavka called it a turning of the tide. But in the villages of Belarus, the meaning was quieter. Old men cleared rubble from the roads. Women marked the graves of the nameless. Children gathered spent shells and helmet straps from the fields. Liberation did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion lifting. The partisan detachments, once secret armies, were disbanded or folded into reconstruction brigades. Their war had ended, but the habit of vigilance remained. As the weeks passed, the great offensive that had begun on the Solstice faded into a line on the map, a red arc stretching from Daugavpils to Lublin. Historians would call it the most decisive victory of the Soviet campaign, yet the story of its flanks would be buried beneath the statistics of the central breakthrough. The names Vitebsk, Bobruisk, Polotsk, Baranovichi would vanish from popular memory, replaced by the more familiar thunder of Minsk. And yet, the soldiers who fought there knew differently. They had waded through marshes where compasses failed, bridged rivers that were never meant to be crossed, and fought enemies who never truly surrendered. They had turned the margins of a map into the hinge of history when they marched westward into Poland. The forests of Belarus receding behind them, few looked back, but if they had, they would have seen the pattern clearly at last, the twin arcs of north and south curving inward, meeting across a broken land, closing the trap that ended an empire. Those were the forgotten flanks of Operation Bagration, the silent geometry of victory, where rivers, swamps, and partisans shaped the fate of nations. And in that quiet aftermath, amid the smoke of burned bridges and the dawn light over the Berezina, the war in the east had already decided its course.